Hello, this is Ashgabat Cat, and I recently played through Metroid Dread, and honestly, I've got a lot of thoughts about it, so I'd like to collect all of them into one sort of travelogue style video. One of the things that's kind of strange about Metroid Dread is it trains you to play the game without saying anything sometimes. It kind of, I don't know if you remember that Ego Raptor video where he goes over how a game can sort of like organically teach you how to play it without necessarily giving you a tutorial. And the Metroid, it kind of gives you that sort of organic feel. That being said, it's also kind of funny because at the exact same time, the game is sufficiently complicated. It's actually so complicated just looking at all of the controls. Now, that's not necessarily like a Metroid Dread specific thing, because if you take a look at, like, I don't know, for example, Super Metroid, that game also used every button on the Super Nintendo gamepad, and trust me, once you have individual shoulder buttons for shooting diagonal up and shooting diagonal down, you might have too many buttons, and you might want to refine your control scheme. And it's also kind of interesting how, like, because this game is so good about teaching you everything about Metroid, like, well, here I am saying that it teaches you everything organically, but it doesn't, because sometimes when you collect the power-ups, then you get the nice little video that kind of shows you exactly how to use the power-up, but it also shows you, like, some of the neat, like, ins and outs. So, for example, like, with the spider ball thing, like, you can hold up to kind of hold Samus up even a little more, and it helps you avoid the Emmys a little bit better. But it's like, this is a small little nuance that you wouldn't necessarily have known existed. And then also, like, for example, Shine Spark. Yeah, you can read, like, a GameFAQs guide about how to Shine Spark in Super Metroid, but you still have no idea if you're, like, actually doing it or not. And then when you finally do it, you're like, what the heck is this? This feels like cheating. But in Metroid Dread, I mean, it shows you a video of Shine Sparking, or at least it mentions it, and it's like, it shows you the video of you doing Shine Sparking. You're like, that's awesome, I want to do that. And in fact, Metroid Dread expects you to do that if you want to get 100%. I mean, it is kind of interesting because you take a look at the control scheme of Metroid Dread, and quite frankly, it's even more complicated than Super Metroid. I mean, frankly, the ZL to duck under ledges and stuff, that still didn't feel natural until, like, I don't know, about halfway through the game. But that's the really weird thing about this game and the control scheme. Like, it does feel natural after a while. Even like the Omega Cannon controls, like the very first time, like, I don't know, it just kind of messes with you because it contrasts with standard missile controls, because like standard missile controls, you hold R and you rapid fire Y. But with the Omega Cannon, you only ever hold down Y to auto fire. In fact, if you try to mash it, which I did a few times because I must have forgotten that or something, then actually you shoot slower and you don't shoot fast enough to kill the Emmy. Don't do that. Hold down Y with the Omega Cannon. But, well, maybe it also helps because once you get the storm missiles, you always are holding down R. Like, I don't know, for me it just seemed very weird that you hold down R to, like, charge up the final cannon, but then you get used to holding down R to charge up for the storm missiles, and, like, I don't know, it's weird. Maybe it's just Stockholm Syndrome, but, like, the game makes sense after a while, and it's strange, because you play something like Super Metroid, and, like, the game, like you can kind of get used to Super Metroid, but, like, I don't know, I feel like the control scheme never quite made sense. Now, okay, maybe some of that's on me, because when I played through Super Metroid, I played through it all on an arcade stick. And I don't know if you've ever thought about, like, remapping things to an arcade stick, but once you get past, like, 4 buttons, 6 buttons, it gets a little interesting. And especially Super Metroid, where you press select to switch over to missiles. It's like, select is never going to be one of your primary buttons. I really wish they'd just map a missile to, like, a button or something. You press the missile button, you shoot a missile, but at the same time, I mean, they had plenty of other buttons. Although, wasn't there a button for, like, the sensor or something? Maybe that could have lost the cut. I don't know, it just, Super Metroid, like, it just seemed like the control scheme is just janky enough, like, you could only ever mostly make friends with. Also too, Super Metroid had this thing where, like, it really seems to want to distinguish the spin jumps from, like, just the straight up, pure up jumps. But, like, and so with Super Metroid, it's like, I don't know, I just constantly felt like I was fighting the game, because it's like I'd always be like, okay, I just want to straight up hop here, but it's like, oh, you want to spin jump forward? Or it's like if I want to spin jump forward, it's like, oh, but did you mean a straight up jump? And it's just, it's the game just seems to have its own mind. But playing Metroid Dread, I mean, I never had that problem with like just straight up jumps and like or the spin jumps. And the weird thing is, like, I double checked the footage. I replayed through the game. I had to replay through an hour to get this footage. But like it just wasn't really an issue. I mean, yeah, it's kind of the same sort of deal, but like it's weird because you're not like locked into it, I guess. I don't know. I just feel like with Metroid Dread, they took a look at like all the previous games in the series, saw what worked, saw what didn't, and just kind of refined it. Because especially like Fusion's approach on the controls. Because in Fusion, the shoulder buttons, rather than like being silly and mapping them to one to diagonal up, one to diagonal down, you mapped one to like shooting diagonally and the one to switching to missiles. And that makes a whole lot more sense. Because the thing is, if you like shooting diagonals, you almost always only want diagonal up. And if you want diagonal down, like diagonal up, diagonal down, all you have to do is press hold the trigger and then up and down, and it's like those are two completely different inputs. You're not going to be confusing one of them with another. And so it's smart. It works. And it's just kind of like in the same way that Fusion was the smart refinement of Super Metroid. The Metroid Dread is almost like the smart refinement of Metroid Fusion. Now, one sort of interesting thing that one is always tempted to do once there are like so many games in the series is to kind of go back and kind of rank them. But what's interesting about the Metroid series is like it's all just like a blur of platforming. Like I try to go back and think back to any of the previous Metroid games, and like yeah, like I was just able to kind of focus on the control scheme and sort of differentiate them based on the control scheme. But like when I think about like any of the actual things you do within any of the games, like I kind of can't. They're just like these perfect blurs of platforming that kind of like ultimately culminate in some sort of timer at the end. And it's like the very beginning I can kind of remember, the very end I can kind of remember, but anything in between is just this like blur of platforming or being completely lost in a map. But I mean, your brain naturally tends to edit out your failures like that, right? So we're talking about the original Metroid game. Oh man, that game is rough. And like, it's very strange because looking at all the other Metroid games, I mean, you're on 16-bit software, or 16-bit hardware and above, and so like, there's a certain amount of richness you can give to a game, but you look at the original Metroid, and you have to like reconcile that with the fact that like, this is the same system which gave you Super Mario Brothers, and in fact, for which Super Mario Brothers was basically like the pinnacle of gameplay on that system. And so here you are playing a Metroid game, and like frankly, it really does feel like some sort of Nintendo game, like sort of a Super Mario Brothers, but you can go the other direction. But like at the same time, it's not that much different than Super Mario Brothers. And it is weird, especially with like the complete lack of save points. So like you die, you go right back to the very beginning, and that is just absolutely rough. Or the fact that like you have this sprawling world you have to explore, but they don't give you any sort of map. I mean, I guess in typical Nintendo or NES fashion, you're supposed to make a map as you go. But also, like, the rooms all feel the same, because it's like, it's a Nintendo game, it's an NES game. I mean, there's not enough space in the cart for each room to feel different. And so you do go through like the same room twice, and it's like, is the game glitching out? Am I just like so lost? And this is like some sort of Zelda Lost Maze sort of deal where I went through the wrong door and so it repeats? And it's like, nope, that's just how it was. That's just what it's like. And then also too, how like you can't crouch, but like essentially every enemy you encounter early on is at crouch level, and it's just like, oh my god, man. Oh my god, this is almost a little too much. I can't believe that anybody played that and enjoyed that. To me, Metroid really starts at Super Metroid. Like, before that, like, game systems are just not strong enough. Like, game making sensibilities are just not refined enough to, like, make a proper Metroidvania. Also, I guess maybe more explicitly comparing Dread to Fusion, it's kind of interesting how, like, well, so I mean, Fusion is, of course, like, story-wise, the game that comes before Metroid Dread. But at the same time, it's almost kind of like more of a forgotten one. Like, I don't know, everybody just kind of looks at it, and I mean, maybe 50-50, like, people like it better than Super Metroid, but I feel like at the same time, if all you did was refer back to Super Metroid and just you basically completely wrote off Fusion as this sort of like footnote, then I think people would understand where you're coming from. But it's interesting, like, that Dread, it doesn't really take from Super Metroid, it really takes from Metroid Fusion. And so Fusion had that, like, sort of nice refinement of Super Metroid's control scheme, and so Dread has that sort of nice refinement of Fusion's control scheme. And so Fusion took Super Metroid's wide-open gameplay and kind of squashed it down into, like, this pseudo, mostly linear experience. And so Dread kind of takes Fusion's mostly pseudo-linear experience, well, mostly linear experience, and makes it into, like, this sort of pseudo-lit linear experience. And then also, too, Fusion has this sort of, like, omnipresent AI character who, like, I mean, yeah, he pretty much only talks to you when you're going down, up and down elevators, but, like, there were a lot of those metaphorical elevators in Fusion. And so Dread kind of, like, adds in this sort of faceless AI companion. And it's interesting that they went with, like, Fusion rather than Super Metroid. I guess it's not that interesting. I mean, it's that, like, it's that they're pretty much just following from the most recent game. But it's interesting because you look at, like, the speedrunning community, and sort of, like, the speedrunning community arguably was born out of Super Metroid, and you have Super Metroid as just being, like, at the absolute core of the speedrunning community. You have it where it's like you look at awesome games done quick, and, like, Super Metroid is the ultimate culmination event that they have at the very end to kind of culminate the entire speedrun event. And it's very strange because it's like Metroid Fusion, it's like, I don't even think they ran Metroid Fusion at AGDQ. I mean, that's not true. They ran absolutely every game at AGDQ, but, like, I feel like it would have been relegated to, like, some sort of weird Metroid block, or it's like, oh, well, let's go back, have some fun, and play the old original Metroid and mix it up. But it's like, they always return back to Super Metroid for some reason. And so it's interesting that, like, even though in, I don't know, maybe that society, Super Metroid is sort of the core, for Metroid Dread, it seemed like Metroid Fusion was their core, and everything kind of comes back to Metroid Fusion. Now, one of the reasons why I think Metroid Fusion felt so linear was because the game would, like, when it showed off, when you unlocked, like, these sort of new areas, it would also simultaneously lock you off from previous areas. And so, where Super Metroid was content to let you explore the entire planet at any point in time, Fusion was more like, okay, you've explored this part, we're going to close that off, now we want you to explore this part. And it's interesting how Metroid Dread, in sort of continuing on with the Metroid Fusion sort of deal, it also does the same thing. And so it also kind of closes things off. Like, for example, with the charge beam thing where you shoot the giant blocks back. I mean, yeah, a lot of the times it's just raw empty space behind it, so it's like, okay, yeah, you're unlocking a new path. But more than a few times you shoot it, and it, like, falls into this, like, neat notch in the ground, and, like, you're like, oh, okay, it's a neat notch in the ground, it fits. But previously that was, like, your path through the area, and so you essentially just, like, blocked it off. I don't know why that one was the first example that came to mind, but it is very interesting how in Metroid Dread, they like, so often block off previous places. Now, at the same time, like, the map is sufficiently sprawling and confusing that I think if you really wanted to go from point A to point B, I don't want to say you go from any point to any point at any point in time, but it's probably, like, they mostly just closed off, like, the most obvious paths, and, like, maybe there's some sort of, like, backwoods shortcut you could take. But it is interesting how much in, like, this game that's supposed to be all about exploration, how often they close a path to some previous area. I feel like it also kind of helps that the game very much prioritizes gameplay over story. So, like, when you experience a Metroid game, you're pretty much experiencing the gameplay of the Metroid game. Like, in terms of the actual Metroid story, I mean, there's more story in the beginning and ending of a Metroid game than there is anywhere near in between. Like, first 15 minutes, last 15 minutes, these are like 8-hour games, but there's more story in the first 15 minutes and last 15 minutes than, like, anywhere in between. Well, that does kind of bring me into the story. And so it's, I don't know, it's just kind of interesting to look at the story. And so, like, not the actual, like, contents per se, like, not actually what happens, but, like, if Metroid is a game solely about gameplay, but like humans they crave that sort of story to kind of give some sort of context to their experience, how do you structure that story? Like, how do you come up with a story that can like neatly fit within this game, just kind of nicely frame everything, but at the same time have essentially no content, so that if somebody wanted to, you know, completely ignore the story, they absolutely could. And so it's kind of interesting how like Metroid Dread structures the story. I mean, essentially, in the very beginning, you get like mugged, you get like left for dead, you get all your power stolen, you get stuck in the core of the map. But it's like, that's it. That's where it ends. And so essentially, the way the story has to work, or the way the story does work, is like it sets up this big central mystery, i.e. like, you know, what happened to you. It kind of piles it onto this existing mystery of like, what's the deal with that footage? And then it kind of like leaves you to it, and it kind of hopes that that mystery, like solving the mystery, is enough of a draw, and the core gameplay is enough of a draw to keep you going. And you know what? It really is. But it's interesting that like, in terms of the story, like they had to go for the, like, here's a big mystery, you should go through and solve it. It's not so much like, I don't know, like a tale of revenge or anything like that. I mean, yeah, I can't imagine Samus is like particularly happy with what happened, but I feel like Samus is like way more interested in figuring out like who her assailant was, far more than like getting any sort of revenge. I mean, I feel like Samus is the sort of person who like just kind of walks around, and as soon as you cross her, then it's like, well, she has to take you out. But at the same time, like if you're just existing, like those stupid crab enemies, like they don't even attack you at first. They just kind of exist. They're not even facing the right way if you think about it. So if you want to just jump over them, they're like totally fine with that. And I feel like that kind of summarizes what Samus is all about. You cross her, you're dead. But if you're not, she's gonna just jump past you, because like she's got a time limit to make. She doesn't have time to go around killing every enemy. Also, the nice thing about the story is that like even exploring the world itself kind of becomes part of that story, and they kind of fold it back into that mystery. But it's interesting because it's like you get to this new area, and then like you get kind of stuck, and so it's like, okay, well, let's go off to this other new area. And I mean, yeah, sure, it's all linear, it's all kind of like scripted in a way, but it does make it feel very interesting. It might ultimately be a bit more linear, like Metroid Fusion was linear, than compared to like Super Metroid, which literally just gives you the keys to the kingdom, and it's just like, I don't know, entertain yourself or something. Maybe there's a bad guy, who knows? Does this game even have a story? But like Metroid Fusion kind of felt like Metroid Fusion kind of was linear, because it really did just have you go from location to location. It's like, oh, you unlocked a new power-up. Well, remember that thing that I pointed out earlier that you couldn't get past? Well, you're going to go unlock it. You're going to get a completely new area, explore the area, and then you're going to go. But like Metroid Dread, you have no idea what you're in for. You'd be like halfway through exploring an area, and it's like, oh, well, time to take a detour in the other area. You'd be like fighting an Emmy, and then it's like, oh, well, you can't beat this guy, let's beat another Emmy first. And it's just like madness. But I love it. One of the cool things about that madness, though, is like, it's non-linear enough to feel non-linear, even though it is ultimately linear. But because it is linear, then like you have that yardstick to compare yourself. So like if you ever wanted, like, you really can go back to Metroid Dread and just kind of like time yourself in some sort of speed run, like try to follow the same linear path, but like not get lost this time. And like that really exists as an option, and you really can like compare yourself with a yardstick and see, it's like, oh yeah, I can do this way faster this time. But like you're going through the same obstacle course you went through the last time. Whereas Super Metroid, I mean, once you get to the end, it's like, I'm not even sure you can remember which way is which. You're just like, yeah, I'll go here, I guess. I remember the right place to go. It's like in this sort of direction. But like Metroid Dread, it's like, okay, so you go through this obstacle course, and you go through this obstacle course, and you go through this obstacle course. And it's just kind of nice that you can compare yourself. Oh man, the Emmys. Quite frankly, so important that they make up the titular Dread. Like, frankly, I mean, I didn't really watch all the trailers that much, so I didn't really know what I was in for. So when I saw that first enemy, that first Emmy, well, that first Emmy was a joke, and I think everybody's supposed to know that. But once you get to the first Emmy that can actually kind of attack you, I don't know, just something about enemies that you can't destroy just kind of like bugs me on a core psychological level. And so once you see that first enemy, and it's like, yeah, okay, you can jump on the ledge, you can shoot at it, and like it absolutely cannot get you. But at the same time, like just looking down at him, I just felt this foreboding sense that is like, if I stayed here a little too long, it would figure it out, and then it would get me. Like, I don't know, just the enemies just initially had this like strong visceral impact. I was feeling like legitimate dread as I'm like in the Emmy area. It's like, oh no, not another Emmy area. I don't want to die. But it's also weird because as you like progress through the game and you see like the Emmys over and over and over, and you kind of start realizing how they fit into like the gameplay at large, they stop being like a lot less of actual sources of dread, and they just more becomes like, okay, it's an Emmy time. Oh, we're entering an Emmy area. All right, time to flex my platforming skills as I go through this obstacle course. And I mean, yeah, sure, you have to kind of figure out like the right way, and you have to figure out like, okay, when do I activate my invisibility? And then even once you do get the Omega Cannon, you do have to figure out, it's like, okay, where's the perfect spot to ambush the Emmy? But it's very interesting that like after a while, I don't know, I guess maybe gameplay trumps story, but you get to this point where it's like you just see the Emmys less as like an actual story thing and more just like a core gameplay mechanic. And like, yeah, ultimately them being reduced down to this gameplay mechanic is kind of funny, but if you think about it, the Metroid series as a whole always had this sort of like concept, because like in Super Metroid, the bosses are essentially just missile gates. They're just testing like, hey, have you collected enough missiles in order to be able to spam enough missiles to kill this guy? And I mean, yeah, sure, there's like a little bit of skill, but essentially all you have to do is learn the enemy's patterns just enough for you to be able to dodge, then learn where do you shoot them, and then apply as many missiles as fast as you can. And now I want to say that Dread kind of, sorry, not even Dread, just like Fusion beforehand, kind of moved a little bit away from this, but I don't know, I feel like it's just something core and inherent to the whole Metroid world, that the bosses, like, they have to be difficult enough, it takes you maybe more than one time to beat them, but at the same time, they have to be, like, easy enough that, like, in a certain sense, they're ultimately just, like, big, weirdly colored doors. And so, I guess the fact that the Emmys are ultimately reduced down to this sort of like gameplay mechanic, this sort of like, can you beat this obstacle course quickly enough sort of thing, I feel like that's ultimately very natural, and like, I guess it shouldn't be so surprising. Oh yeah, one of the things I really liked about this game was like the Adam voice. I don't know, just something about maybe the way I tuned my soundbar and just the way it like slightly rumbled as it does his like weird robotic voice. I mean, I listen to it on like my monitor speakers, and like it's a lot less interesting there, but I don't know, it's just kind of fun. I also like how he just kind of has this like cold robotic feel to it. Like he gives this cold robotic feel to the experience. Like, I mean, ultimately it's a Metroid game and you're on your own, but at the same time, if you were tasked with adding a companion to the game that, like, I don't know, is a perfect companion for Samus, but at the same time Samus is this ultimate loner who like never wants any companionship anyway, it's like, yeah, you probably would give her this sort of like cold metallic AI. But like, that being said, even though he is this sort of like cold metallic AI, I do like how he gives you some sort of like direction to the game. Like right in the very beginning, he's like, okay, Samus, you've just been mugged. Now in order to get your stuff back, you're gonna have to go back to your ship. And I mean, yeah, sure, it turns out that like the ship is ultimately some sort of juke out, and like even once you're within spitting distance of your ship, it's still a locked door between you and your ship. But like, it's that little bit of narrative guiding that I think really helps this game, especially compared to like a game like, I don't know, Super Metroid, where they basically just give you this entire planet Zebus. It's like, yeah, there's a thing at the end, I don't know what it is and I'm not going to tell you. Well, okay, I'll tell you, it's called Mother Brain, but that's it, that's all you're getting. You're gonna have to go and figure it out on your own, and like, you're just given essentially no guidance, and it's like you're going along and you're like beating a boss, you're going to a new area, and you're like, wait, is this where I'm supposed to be going, or like, is this a trick? Am I just like wasting my time? And some of the time you are wasting your time, and I don't know, it just like after a while the experience just becomes a little bit too like you have to self-motivate yourself a little bit too much, whereas Metroid Dread, it's like you constantly have that ship, and he just talks about that ship over and over, but it kind of helps because it gives you that one central location, that one central goal, and it's like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing, but I gotta get closer to that ship. And it's like, oh, I'm taking an elevator to a place further up, it's getting me closer to that ship. I get it, there's some context here. And also too, he mentions that one time when he mentions, it's like, oh man, you better get that space jump, you better get that spin dash or whatever. No, not the spin dash, but like the gravity suit. And it's like all of a sudden your mind starts like salivating with like the possibilities of what those things could be. Now as it turns out, you don't get them anytime soon, and as it turns out, you don't really even use them all that much. But it's like just that promise of what comes next, because that's another thing that like Super Metroid had. Like, yeah, there were a lot of cool power-ups, and like if you've played a Metroid game before, then you don't really need that sort of like motivation. Or if you've seen a Metroid game, you don't quite need that motivation. But if this is your very first time playing a Metroid game, then like you really do kind of need to know that there's that carrot dangling over the horizon that you're gonna go for. Because otherwise it's just kind of like, okay, why even go? Is there anything fun left in this game? Is this really just like a block shooting simulator? Well, I kid. It's a block bombing simulator too. Oh yeah, and then the very last cutscene where like they reveal that the Adam you were listening to the entire time you were like in the core and beyond, it turns out it was just Ravenbeak just doing some Adam impression. And I love it. I also kind of get this impression with like Ravenbeak when he's like in that cutscene, he's talking to Sam. It's like, get real like, Luke, I am your father. Join me and we shall rule the universe together vibes. And then Samus just doesn't even like explicitly answer. She just like shoots at him, and it's great. I mean, even Luke, like, well, I don't actually remember seeing the original trilogy, but I want to say even Luke like kind of pondered it for a second. Metroidvanias are kind of jank. Metroid Dread special jank is there's this one area where like, okay, you take the elevator, you get to this new area, you follow the linear path, and you get lost. Or no, you get stuck because there's absolutely nothing you can do. And then as it turns out, what you should have done is gone the absolute other way, shot through some blocks, and then you can continue on with your story. No, I mean, obviously I beat the game, and obviously I figured it out, but like, that took me like a good, I don't know, half hour to figure out, and like, believe me, I was absolutely lost. And especially that elevator scene, that is a long elevator scene, and I had to watch that a few times as I cycled back and forth. It's like, okay, so we unlocked the new area, but do we have to go to the new area? Maybe it wants me to go back to the previous area and do some things? Oh man, and also too, this is early enough, so like, you haven't quite figured out what the game's angle is, you haven't quite figured out like, how the game is going to dole out future story events, or not future story events, but just like future places to go to. And so you're still just kind of getting used to that. It's like, okay, it gave me the elevator, but does it really want me to take the elevator or not? And it's just, that is a very odd time to place it. Of course, it's not like this is the only game that does it. Somebody pointed off on this social media network I'm part of that essentially every Metroidvania has their jank part. And I was thinking back to it, and I recently played through Ender Lilies, which is another sort of Metroidvania. Although I feel like that's a Metroidvania that follows maybe a little bit more from like the Game Boy Advance Castlevania games rather than like, you know, the pure Metroid series. But in that game, there are like these waterfalls that you can like climb up, but like they pretty much only show up in the water level. And it's like, okay, or that, you know, the half-submerged aqua water forest sort of thing. And it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thematically, there's water everywhere. Makes sense that they're a bit like these magical waterfalls that you fly up. I mean, sure, there's magic everywhere in the game. That makes sense. Or in this particular area, it's all about magic. But as it turns out, and this is another area where I got lost for like, I don't know, an hour. Although this one, I actually had to go out so far as to look up in a guide where to go because I was just like so lost and it seemed like the entire map was a possibility. But like, it turns out there's this waterfall in this sort of like catacombs blood sort of area, and it's like, this area does not feel like the nice water forest at all. It does not feel like there should be a waterfall. And as it turns out, well, the way the game does these waterfall transparency effects is like, it's transparent, it's see-through. Like, it's so hard to miss if you're not looking for it. So essentially, I missed one of these waterfalls, and it's just like, that's so jank. That's so jank. But if you think about it, like, why does it have to be so jank? Like, why does every Metroidvania always have this one sort of area that's jank? And I feel like it's ultimately because Metroidvania, when you get down to it as a genre, it's sort of this tension between being obtuse, because it has to be obtuse enough that once you figure it out, you get that sense of achievement, but it also has to be easy enough that, like, you know, you can actually do it. Like, they can't just give you a map of the US and it's like, okay, navigate from this one place to this other place in this giant city, and it's like, but how do I get there? Like, I don't know, man. I don't even know if you can. I don't know, it's just weird like that. But it's like, it's a tension inherent to the genre, so it's like, well, I mean, Metroid Dread is not the first Metroidvania to have a jank moment, and it's not gonna be the last. Oh man, the cutscenes in this game, especially the boss cutscenes, they are just absolutely awesome. Because it's like, you watch that, you just watch Samus be this, like, absolute badass, and it's like, you know, by extension, you're like, okay, yeah, I'm badass. Even if you just, like, unlock the cutscene by limping your way through a boss fight, you have essentially 0 energy left, you used up all your missiles 5 minutes ago, and you've just been limping with a charge shot. You see that cutscene at the end when, like, the bosses, I mean, none of them are literally begging for help because, you know, they can't talk, but they're essentially begging for help with their body language, and you just have Samus just coldly charging up a charge blast, and then just, like, placing it in their mouth and just obliterating them. Oh man, that's great. And, like, they're especially nice because they finally set a tone for the Metroid series. Now, I feel like the Metroid series has always kind of had this, like, air that, like, Samus is this cool bounty hunter. But I feel like essentially in the past, the only way they could really communicate this was with, like, the cover art. And I mean, yeah, you can draw the coolest cover art in the world, but, like, you're only going to see it for, like, maybe 10 minutes, maybe half an hour if you have to, like, drive on the way home, and, like, looking at the cover art and the instruction manual is all you have. But once you have that, once you boot up the game, that's it. You're going to forget about it, and eventually you're going to let the game itself dictate how you view it.